Well, we've seen various characterizations of the 1950s as being the time of quiet and calm in the wake of the troops returning from World War II, and Oregon certainly was part of that. There was a sense, though, in the broader culture that as the economy grew, as families grew, as people grew, that maybe we were a maturing society, an evolving society, and that the death penalty, again, was a remnant of an earlier period that we ought to get rid of.
There was a sort of a liberal leaning and a more socially progressive, I think, attitude in politics, an idea of let's move out from the 1940s and 50s into a more enlightened era.
Death penalty opponents perceived a window of opportunity and organized quickly. They focused their efforts on challenging not the ethics of capital punishment, but the science of it. Influenced by scholar Hugo Bedeau and armed with powerful statistics, they challenged accepted notions about deterrence, the risks of parole, and above all else, they questioned the fairness of the system for racial minorities. But they still needed a local champion for their cause, preferably one with popular influence and political clout. They found an unlikely ally in the Republican Party.
Mark Hatfield, governor of the state of Oregon, is a prime and attractive example of the new generation of American leaders who are coming into positions of power in our politics. Whatever his direction, he has made himself one of the figures in his generation to be reckoned with.
In the late 50s, this religious man who had once pursued a career in the ministry was thriving in Oregon's political scene. He defeated incumbent Robert Holmes to reach the highest office in the state at the age of 36. This made him the youngest governor in Oregon since Oswald West.
So I would say that the politician who compromises principle is not a man who is going to really contribute much to the welfare and the benefit of his fellow man.
And although Hatfield is now known for his opposition to the death penalty, back in the late 50s and early 60s, when he successfully ran against Holmes, he was much more muted in his criticism of the death penalty.
During his first term in office, the governor's position on capital punishment will be tested twice. In February of 1961, a 40-year-old logger beat, stabbed, and shot his girlfriend and her 23-month-old son. Leroy Mackay was convicted of murder and sentenced to die. Mackay requested a commutation, and Governor Hatfield was inclined to grant it.
He was supportive of abolition, but he also made it very clear that he didn't feel it was his role to go beyond what the people of Oregon had voted, so that if the law was on the books, he felt it was his need to carry it out.
You can stand for a certain issue, you can fight for a certain point of view, but then you have to be aware of the mechanics and the procedures which implement this idea.
Governor Hatfield allowed the execution to go forward. He instructed the state to connect a phone from the governor's mansion to the state penitentiary so that he could halt the execution even with only 1 minute before midnight. He prayed that evening with his wife and children and waited out the night in what he later termed absolute agony. At midnight, Leroy Mackay was escorted into a gas chamber that had been installed in the state penitentiary in 1937. The state had initially planned to test the effectiveness of the chamber on a dog. This being Oregon, a public outcry forced the state to spare the dog. A rat was used instead. On the night of August 20th, 1962, Governor Hatfield received a call from the state warden informing him that the deed was done. It was later reported that Mackay was calm before his execution. His last words were, "That's it." 4 decades later, the governor would still be haunted by second thoughts. He would never completely rest with his decision. For him, it started all over again when 2 children were found at the bottom of the Crooked River Gorge.
Janice June Freeman's homicide, it was really a dual homicide that she did with a woman with whom she was purported to be in a lesbian relationship.
She was with her lover, and whose 2 children were in the back of their car, apparently fighting and making noise, and Janice June Freeman got upset and threw the children into the Crooked River Gorge.
Yeah, that was an unbelievable, those kind of offenses fortunately don't happen very often.
The mail to Governor Hatfield at that time was, he says, at least 5-1, pushing for execution.
Gertrude Nunez received a life sentence. Janice June Freeman was granted the distinction of being the first and only woman in Oregon history to be sentenced to death. If ever there was a case I might have thought deserved the death penalty, she was it. So said Mark Hatfield, who still opposed capital punishment and was now more determined than ever to advocate for its repeal.
He was very clear in his opposition to the death penalty, which for him was not merely moral but also religious.
His influence fueled a rapidly growing movement. In the winter of 1963, a handful of young activists founded the Oregon Council to abolish the death penalty. They persuaded the Oregon legislature to adopt an anti-death penalty measure, contingent on voter approval.
My father had a bumper sticker on the back of our station wagon that said, "Abolish the death penalty." Made sense to me at the time.
Their tactics were rarely subtle, but their message, even in the wake of Janice June Freeman's high-profile crime, steadily won over influential supporters.
There had been a fairly long lead-up. Most public policymakers in Oregon, including the political leadership, all were convinced that the death penalty was not an appropriate response in Oregon. And I think it was fairly unique in the United States in that the entire political leadership structure, bipartisan, rural and urban, all lined up behind the campaign.
In November of 1964, a measure to abolish capital punishment was once again on the ballot. Remarkably, it was endorsed by Oregon's most influential newspaper. It passed by a significant margin. It was good news on death row. "I feel like I'm born again," Janice June Freeman said when she heard the news. She was never executed.
Her sentence was commuted from death by Governor Hatfield. And one of the ironies is that Janice Freeman has been living, I believe, a free life for more than 20 years in the United States now.
Oregon's gas chamber was put out of commission and eventually dismantled for spare parts. The issue that would bring the death penalty back to Oregon was all too familiar.
Hugo Bedeau had done some studies to show that people who commit these horrendous crimes are not recidivists because mostly they're committed with people they know or in the kind of situations that wouldn't easily be repeated. As the 70s wore on, and as Oregon still had in place a law which said that even a first-degree murderer could get out after 7 years, some of them got out and started to do pretty severe crimes.
And for me, that was sort of emblematic of a rather naive way of looking at the criminal justice system, which is to say all people can be saved if we're just nice enough to them. And that nobody is so bad that they should either be locked up for the rest of their life or, in extreme cases, maybe even put to death. And what happened in the late 1970s, what happened in the mid-70s, as crime rose in the United States, as violence became worse, was, I think, a recognition that there are some very bad people out there. There are some people that are frankly beyond redemption.
This is classic Oregon. It's one of the great things about our state that it doesn't take many people to get a movement going. And a couple of people in Sherwood, Oregon, who were very disturbed about a killing that occurred there, as volunteer citizens, got very involved in trying to promote the death penalty, and they showed a great deal of tenacity.
Mark Hatfield, instrumental in the campaign to abolish capital punishment, had moved on to the Senate.
So in 1978, there was a movement to bring back the Oregon death penalty. Indeed, it passed by initiative petition fairly handily. Oregon officially then had a death penalty starting at the end of 1978, once again.
Oregon's death penalty was back, but it wouldn't be used again for 18 years.